thank you very much. Well, it's very exciting to be here at the first Bufo Alvarius conference. I'm very honoured to be invited, and I'd like to congratulate Mario and Greg and Susan and all the people who've been doing all the work. Doing a great job of bringing us all together. I am somewhat, it's interesting that I'm up here speaking after a long list of doctors and various people presenting their scholarly studies, because I'm far from a doctor. And the reason I'm here is in July of 2003, shortly before my 36th birthday, I smoked 5-methoxy DMT for the very first time. I had gotten this compound via the mail. It was legally available from research chemical companies. And the amount of information I had read about it was almost nothing to read. I had certainly never read the suggestion that it would induce a mystical experience. Most of the things I had read were quite terrifying, to be honest. And I thought, I found it because I was interested in DMT. And I looked for DMT for a number of years. And in those days, pre-internet, the DMT was still pretty rare. The extraction recipes that have allowed a lot of DMT to come into our society more recently. So it's actually no particular importance to the event and approaching it with the same characteristic lack of caution that has accompanied many of my various adventures in life. I sat down on a mattress in a nondescript suburban house in Portland, Oregon, and drew the strange tasting smoke deep into my lungs. I remember looking at my friend whose house we were in and wondering when something would happen, and then it reminded me to breathe out. When I did that, my old world, indeed my old life, magically evaporated. Now what I'm reading is the start of a book that I would eventually write about my experiences. But on this night, there was certainly no clue of any of that. It was very interesting seeing Dr. Joseph's talk about 7-7, because in my particular case, I was the exact opposite. I had actually been at, I would say I was at the psychedelic low point of a fairly long psychedelic career. I had just been at the Oregon Country Fair, not the fair, the fair, in Oregon, which is a renowned psychedelic cultural event, and I had not been able to get into the night part of the party, which is when they're supposed to gets really psychedelic at night because they close the gates, and everybody lucky enough to be part of the scene gets to stay in, and the rest of us will get pushed out. So I was a huge fan of Ken Kesey, and I was rather incensed that the hippies would throw me out of their private party. And I had actually gone out there to smoke 5-mg DMT with the one friend who I knew had smoked it. And he turned up in a complete wreck of shape due to another misadventure, and was clearly not the guy I was going to smoke with. And then we did get into the Oregon Country Fair. And I must say, in retrospect, I'm glad we didn't get it. Because I think if I had smoked 5-mg DMT inside the mythological confines of that psychedelic cultural event, I might have had a different result. As it was, I went back to my friend's apartment in Portland, another friend, and he was like, "Oh, you got that DMT stuff?" And I was like, "Yeah, I do, let's smoke it." and at that point I thought it was like going to be a cross between a bong hit and hit of acid, and that I had plenty of experience in psychedelics, and that certainly the idea that I was going to learn anything new from a psychedelic that night had not occurred to me. I would have been quite contemptuous with the whole idea. So I'm just going to go through a rundown for you what happens to my consciousness when I personally smoke 5-mg DMT, whether synthetic or toad. I am going to get to talk about toads a little bit more here, but a lot of what I'm going to talk about is just 5-mg DMT specific. First is the dissolution into the fractals of light on exhalation. Then there's a transportation by a rapid acceleration into that white light. At this point, there's a complete dissolution of ego and identity in any concept of time. as they dissolve in the resonance of the One, that thing that William James called cosmic consciousness. There is a subsequent recognition of the unity of all things, and/or that love is the principle that organizes the universe. Then, as the compound wears off, I feel there's a fear arising from the disorientation caused by transition back to restricted consciousness, which causes the return of the ego. Like for me, the real defining part of the 5-methoxy-DMT experience is existing as consciousness without identity, which means I am in a field of consciousness. I am entirely conscious that I am that consciousness, but I have no idea of who I am or where I came from. And it's usually the questioning, that question, oh, how did this all start? Who am I? That leads back to this very rapid repossession of the physical body, and then back to myself. Now, on this first occasion, my physical body did a lot of other different interesting things. Part of that reason was that I was very ignorant of dosage, and one of the reasons I wrote tryptamine powders was 5-methoxy-DMT is so incredibly potent, and we did not have a scale capable of dividing it, so we got as close as we could, and I cut it into 4 piles, and of course I took the biggest pile because I wanted to make sure it worked. And that was probably over 30, somewhere in between 30 and 40 miles. My experience was about 45 minutes long. We were in a very nondescript office with no religious trappings, no Buddhas, no Ganeshas, no visionary art. It was very nondescript. We had a mattress down on the floor, and this is what happened when I came out. Well, actually, I came out basically doing sun salutations, standing in the corner of the room with dragons and griffins and all these creatures flying around me, and I was completely like, oh, where did I come from, you know? And this sense of amazement continued when I turned around and found my friend and his brother crouched in the corner of the room, somewhat terrified. I had done a haka or a Maori war dance at one point. I got under the mattress. There was some furniture got destroyed. I definitely got a little wild. And my friends were terrified because they had no idea when I would come out or if I would come out. We knew nothing about this compound. It's quite ridiculous. So then when I learned at one point, I got to my feet and ecstatic declared, it exists. And then later, I am there. I could only wonder what had actually happened to me and what it was that I had just experienced. For that half hour, after I'd exhaled from the pipe, I'd come in contact with a force far greater than I'd ever known possible or even imagined, and now felt as if I had blindly stuck my wet finger in the cosmic socket and come away with my senses totally fried. Suddenly smoking 5-methoxy-DMT had become one of the most important events of my life. Why was it so important? In that singular incident, I was changed from being a scientific rationalist atheist who was quite happy and had no real desire to look for God, to somebody who was convinced he'd had a genuine mystical experience. And that was extremely surprising to me. I can tell you that for a fact. I don't think there are many transitions I could have gone through that would have brought more surprise or astonishment to me than that. So that said about, you know, and I'm the kind of person that doesn't really take things that well. I need to try and figure them out, try and come up with an explanation of what I went through. So I then went on a 5-year journey, I call the greatest intellectual adventure of my life, where I researched and poked around and looked at all different corners, and to my surprise, I actually came up with a working theory of how I think the 5-DMT experience works. And we'll get to that a little bit later in the book. But one of the things that was most surprising when I really started to look around was the fact that 5-methoxy-DMT was the only psychedelic known to be produced by an animal, and it was produced by a toad. And I actually knew that before I smoked synthetic for the first time. And one of the beautiful synchronicities that run through my story, I was in Hood River, Oregon the next day, and I was very excitedly talking to my fiance on the phone about what I had been through, trying to explain to her this tremendous experience. And I was in this little park when I started on the phone. I started pacing around, and I walked about half a block to the first store. As I'm talking, and I turn and look, and there's a huge display of glass frogs, one of which I bought. So synchronicities like that run through the psychedelic experience. And that's one of the things I was a little disappointed I didn't hear more about this weekend is synchronicities. I think synchronicities are a very interesting way of moving through the universe, and they're a big part of the psychedelic experience. Stan Groff has a really interesting chapter in his book, When the Impossible Happens, that's dedicated entirely to synchronicities. And my story is pretty full of. I heard this quote, it's one of my favorites. Sweet are the uses of adversity, which like the toad, ugly and venomous, wears yet a precious jewel upon his head. Now, these words of Shakespeare's are quite mysterious, and nobody really knows exactly what he was saying. What we do know is that the Bufo toad and related genera have held a place in humanity's archaic consciousness since time immemorial. The earliest representations of Bufo toads and toads in general go back thousands of years. The appearance of toad-based artifacts is prehistoric and possibly proto-linguistic. It's portrayed in ancient lithographs, paintings, and small sculptures. And anthropologist Peter First places the use of Bufo toad venom back to the Neanderthals over 100,000 years ago. Humans and toads became very much linked as species with the birth of agriculture. Because as we ploughed the fields, the toads found their ideal habitat. And they have been seen through very many different cultures in a number of different ways. As a fertility symbol, because they would emerge out of the ground with the rains. So they were the bringer of the rains and the symbol of the changing of the seasons, protector of the crops. They're also an underworld symbol of death and regeneration, a symbol of magical transformation. And there's an ancient pervasive link, curious link between toads and psychoactive mushrooms to many languages. English, Welsh, Dutch, Norwegian, French, Ukrainian, Basque, all have used words for toads and mushrooms that are interactive. One of the things I find very interesting about the way the toads have been represented, or we have integrated the toad into our religiosity, is it mimics very much Eleusis, which was the myth of Persephone, which is the central myth of the Greek mysteries of Eleusis, which was about the birth of agriculture. When Demeter gave mankind agriculture she was trying to give us immortality, and she was interrupted in her job, so she actually gave us the gift of agriculture. And with Persephone's journey into the underworld and return each year, which is the giver of the seasons. So it's interesting that there's been this, to me, a very clear analogy between Europe's, the Western culture's greatest known psychedelic culture. The Eleusinian mysteries were a psychedelic culture that existed in Greece, that most likely used a grain potion that contained LSAs, very similar to LSD. You're only allowed to do it once in your life, and it ran for 2,000 years, which is almost inconceivable in this system. And many of, I think much of what we are, this conference has attempted to put a factual spin on what we're interested in, and I applaud that. But at the end of the day, we are really on classical mystical ground. And that's when we come to Mexico, in this area, and we have the toad, is it Octavio in the room?
Just over here, brother!
How do I pronounce this? How do I pronounce? Oh, hang on. We change the slides? I don't realize we
I haven't seen any of your slides going on.
We're through like 3-4 slides now. So there he is. Found that.
Go back.
Keep going. Tlaltecutli?
Tlaltecutli. Tlaltecutli.
There you go. The hands-on guardian of the earth who appears in a monstrous devouring form. She is, of course, not just a toad. She is an ideal image of the mediator, by which apparently disparate states are united: life and death, air and water, death and rebirth. At once impressively fertile and also cannibalistic. Metaphor for the earth is the great mother who is at once the giver and taker of life. Now, in this image, I am greatly struck by Shiva. To me, there's a distinctly similar to the Hindu idea of the role of Shiva, which once again came from a psychedelic culture. Because we know that the Vedanta of the Hindus was derived from the use of soma, which was a psychedelic compound that was also used for thousands of years. So it's interesting to me that we have these very similar concepts that run through different cultures that may have been derived at, I believe, from a psychedelic perspective. Next slide, please. So, in my own adventure, I had the synchronicity that I got to go totem. And it was, I didn't really know how I was going to go totem. I just knew that I wanted to go totem. And I had been in New Zealand and had kind of a rough family trip down in New Zealand with my father, who could be a little difficult. And I had been at my friend's farm and smoked 5 mg DMT. And this is the first time I went back to New Zealand after my epiphany. And I couldn't get anybody to try it. But none of my friends would try it. I was so terrified of what happened to me. They would okay. So I smoked by myself. And then I woke up the next morning and I got a rent car and I drove to Christchurch, which was about 100 something miles. Didn't say a word to anybody. Dropped the car off, got on the plane, flew all the way to Los Angeles. Didn't say a word to anybody. I was just so in my head about my experience and what I'd just gone through. And I love plane flights for that. People guessing with me, right? And then, so I get to LA and my plane's delayed. So I got like a few hours to kill. So I'm like, oh, I've got a friend in Venice Beach. I'll go visit her. So I get one of those shared vans. So I get this van. And we're going for a drive, and there's two guys in the van. There's a guy that looks a bit strange, he's got this big piercing in his chin. And there's another guy that's got a surfboard. And I started talking to this guy purely for the fact that I hadn't opened my mouth in about 24 hours. And I was just saying my vocal cords were still working. So we get talking somehow about kiting. And the other fella, with the painful looking piercing, he goes, ooh, what do you think about that kiting? And I was like, oh, I really like it. Oh, my wife just left me for a famous quote. So this started one of the more remarkable conversations I've ever had. Within about 5 minutes of talking to this guy, we had covered the drought of LSD, 5-methoxy-DMT, Sasha Shilbin, and it ended up with me agreeing that I would return to LA 3 months later and he would pick me up and we would go toting. Because he had actually been toting. And that's exactly what happened. 3 months later I flew back to LA and he rolled in this giant bus. And we took off to Arizona on a really mad adventure, which is pretty much one of the more entertaining chapters in my book, Trip to Wind Palace. So even at this point, I thought a book about psychedelics was pretty much unpublished, especially a book about psychedelics and the mystical experience. And it just didn't seem like a good idea, but I was gathering all this data and all this information. I was writing it down just to keep track of myself. So then I hit upon the idea that I would give it away at Burning Man. Because I was very excited about the concept of Burning Man as an art movement in the early 2000s. And I didn't know anyone who had done that. And I thought, Burning Man, I'm going to find the audience who want to read my book. And Tryptamine Palace is very much written as a life raft, where if you've just been at Burning Man and you wandered into a dome and smoked 5 DMT without warning, which has happened to be, and then you wander back out, you know, if you happen to bump into me, I'd be like, well, I'm not saying I got the answers, but this is what happened to me. So over 2 years, I gave away 500 copies in various shape and form, in 2 distinct different versions. And then I was convinced by some of the psychedelic elders that it was good enough for self-publication, and that the psychedelic community would be interested in it. I was, oh, that's pretty cool. So I worked for a while with an editor to get ready to self-publish. And then I, as a writer, because I have been writing for years, I've always hated the idea of getting a book. And the editors, the publishers would tell me that my work was not good enough. And I was like, oh man, just got to get over it. So I'm like, you send a couple of books in, and you're used to getting rejected. So I sent 2 copies off to 2 publishers, and to my astonishment, my favourite publisher, Inner Traditions, accepted it, which took on another whole life. And when I worked with their editors for a couple of years before it finally came out in 2009. So my first experience with 5-DMT was 2003, Toad was 2004, the final copy of the book came out in about 2009. And I've got to say, for somebody that wandered around giving out a book about toads at Burning Man, this conference is pretty wild 15 years later. It's really not something that I expected. So my publishers made the decision to call the book 5-DMT and the Sonoran Desert Toad. I did not particularly want that as the title, but they liked the toading chapters, and obviously it was kind of an exciting part of the story. And especially because I used a lot of Wade Davis's paper with this idea that the 5-DMT toad, the Sonoran Desert Toad, could be the missing psychedelic toad in Mesoamerican myth. And I do believe that's probably true. I do think that if it is true, we've long since lost any knowledge of that. And the same way we've lost knowledge of Soma in the Hindu Vedanta, the same way we've lost the use of Kikion in the Greek tradition. It is something that was quite potentially part of that tradition, but now I feel we're onto a much more modern footing in what we're trying to achieve. So I set out to try and understand through science, rather than shamanism, what was happening to me. Can I have the next slide, please? And I had a couple of questions. One was, what was the light, or where did the light that I experienced when I smoked 5-DMT come from? Because when I studied the study about consciousness, everything I could find out about consciousness said that we need input. We need our eyes, our ears, or different things, take in the sensory data and break it up, turn the screens, and recreate the screen model in our mind. But if you take away the input of data, they don't have any models at all. You don't really understand dreaming. And how could it be that in a room that's completely dark, I could experience the brightest light that I'd ever experienced in my life? So this would be the start of my, next slide please, of my adventure into what is consciousness and how does it work. Next slide please. So pretty quickly, I became convinced that we got it all backwards. That consciousness is not something that's generated by the brain, but is a field that interpenetrates everything in the universe, and that our brain interprets it. And this is actually philosophy. This is called monastic idealism, the idea that consciousness, not matter, is fundamental. And that is actually the basis of most Eastern traditions. The idea that the material world is a construct of consciousness. Now we occupy the opposite paradigm that says everything's physical and that consciousness is an accidental byproduct of chemicals bouncing around. But even in this day and age, our science is starting to tell us that there's actually much more, consciousness is much more involved, next slide please, than we thought. So we come to this idea of consciousness as a field. There was an English physicist called David Bohm who wrote a very important book called Wholeness and Infinite Order. And he posits that there are two realms, one that's energetic and informational and one that's material, and that these two realms interpenetrate and interweave constantly. And according to him, matter is condensed or frozen light, which is to say that matter is light moving slower than the speed of light. So in his ideas, mind and matter exist in these different dimensions. They unfold and unfold into each other, creating the unbroken wholeness that we experience, that is both the mental and the physical world. Because we do occupy this wholeness. Next slide, please. From there, I came across the idea of quantum consciousness. The idea that consciousness is actually occurring at the quantum level, and that there are processes that involve, that we basically supply and subtract information from the holographic field. And this is where I first came across this idea of something called a Bose-Einstein condensate, which is the ultimate state of coherence. Now this is a little tricky to understand, but it's quite crucial to the concepts that I come up with. If you imagine everything in the universe has charge, it is a positive and a negative, whether it's a neuron or an electron, or everything has this positive and negative, much like little compasses for the north and the south. Now, if you imagine that your brain has 100 billion neurons, and these are all like these little compasses, and they're all pointing, say that 80% of them at any given time are pointing north-south. But there's still a significant number of neurons that are actually pointing in other directions. They're not all unified in their state. Now, you have a thing called a Bose-Einstein condensate, which were first discovered in superconductors at low temperatures, but we now believe it exists in other states as well. A very strange thing happens, because when everything snaps into phase, so everything goes in the same direction, it becomes a singular entity. And the boundaries between them actually, in a very physical or real sense, cease to exist. So where you once had 100 billion, you now have one. Now this is not New Age, airy-fairy constructs. This is actual physical, scientific proof. Let's think of a Bose-Einstein condensate. We'll come back to it. And then I was in India and I saw a quote in a newspaper that was attributed to Krishna. I think he was talking to his charioteer right before the big war in the Road, and he says, "Nothing is faster than mind." And I started to think about it. I was like, wow, well, what if that's actually true? And that was when I started to get, next slide, please. You're fitting that I'm not doing that. I said, what if that's true? This is when I really started to consider the idea that light and consciousness were linked entities. And then I came across this quote from Peter Russell in a book called From Science to God. Since light travels at the speed of light, let's imagine a disembodied observer, pure mind with no mass, traveling at the speed of light. Einstein's equations would predict that from light's own point of view, it travels no distance and takes zero time to do so. This points to something very strange about light. Whatever light is, it seems to exist in a realm where there is no before and no after. There is only now. Now, when you think about it, consciousness and light are two things we just take entirely for granted. We don't really think about them very much. I thought consciousness was all figured out. I thought people knew exactly what light is. But when you get into it, there's actually a lot of mystery. Next slide, please. So the next part of my puzzle came out of Jerry Navi's excellent book, The Cosmic Serpent. How many people have read The Cosmic Serpent? Good book, highly recommended. And he came, quite these Bose-Einstein condensates popped back up again. And he was talking about something called the pump state by Herbert Froelich, which are these things called biophotonic emissions. Now, Nabi was looking for the source of the snakes that he saw in ayahuasca. He experienced these big psychedelic pythons that he steps over. It's pretty funny when he talks about it. And he became convinced that our DNA was transmitting knowledge or visions through this biophotonic emissions, which our DNA actually emits light. It just emits light in a very short phase that's not visible to the human eye, but it actually turns out that various organs in our body are emitting this very short wave light. So where Nabi left off, next slide, where Jeremy left off is kind of where I took over. So I was like, well, this is what I'm looking for. This is the source of this light that I'm looking for. So where does it come from? And I found out that it's believed, this happens on what they call virtual particles. And what we've discovered is that the energy of this material world is constantly being propped up by an underlying sea of energy, which we used to be called the quantum vacuum, and is now more scientifically known as the zero-point field, and more popularly known as the Akashic field, thanks to the work of the Hungarian systems theorist Erwin Laszlo. Now what we've discovered, this is once again, the quantum vacuum is what they discovered when if you took, say, a cubic foot of space and you made it a complete vacuum, it should be, and lowered it down to 0 degree Kelvin, it should be entirely devoid of energy. But what it turns out, it's the exact opposite. That it's actually full of electromagnetic fields, and that what we call the vacuum is actually the densest known thing in the universe, because it's completely full of energy. Richard Feynman estimated there's enough energy in a square foot of the vacuum to boil all the oceans in the world. And this has caused me to have a complete flip-flop of the way I used to view the physical universe. Because, we're taught this model of billiard balls floating around in space and all this emptiness, whether it's between the electron and the neutron or between the sun and the planets and everything else. But it turns out this quantum vacuum is actually denser than the material universe. The material universe is actually what Einstein called an intense disturbance in the perfect nature of the field. So what physical materiality, it's only confusing here, it's like a vortice. So the way I now envisage the universe is like a block of ice. And all the physical stuff that we occupy are the holes, like Swiss cheese. It's actually the opposite of what we've been taught, that the physical is the most energetic and the highest state. But it actually turns out that the lowest energy state is where the most energy resides. And what we believe is that this field, which penetrates everything, is holographic in nature, which means that it's capable of storing and carrying an infinite amount of information. So I believe that, next slide please. Two slides please. So in Tryptamine Palace, I come up with this model that basically says if we smoke 5-methoxy-DMT, the resonance or coherence in the neurons in our brains is increased, and we achieve this perfect coherence. And we actually have a boson, like I call a psychological Bose-Einstein condensate. Because if you think about what the 5-minute DMT experience is, it's the singular experience of no divisions, total knowledge, total everything, all as one, which literally is what Bose-Einstein condensate is. Since the publication, next slide please, since the publication of Tryptamine Palace, I refined the model of that, and I'm particularly interested in something called the human microtubule system. And this is from a theory by Roger Penrose and Stuart Hamerhoff. Penrose is an English physicist. Hamerhoff is an anesthetologist from the University of Arizona. who holds the annual consciousness conference. Fascinating man, a little workshop with him. But their model is there's as many microtubules are like a scaffolding of tubular proteins that run throughout all the cells in the body. They're they're one of the smallest things known to man. They're so small, they're almost at the quantum scale. They're almost right down at the Planck length. And there's as many neurons in your brain as there are stars in the Milky Way. There are many microtubules in your body as there are stars in the entire universe. Right? So in the Penrose-Hamerhoff model, they see this quantum light actually running through the tubes, that it forms like an internet for the body inside this scaffolding network that runs through everything. And that information is moving at the speed of light and not locally. Because one of the great mysteries of the human body is how do these tens of thousands of processes going on every second in perfect synchronicity and perfect harmony have actually been compared to a jazz band. And that it seems that there's information going on. The passage of information is believed to be faster than the speed of light. And this has been one of the things that we're pushing up against is Einstein's idea that nothing goes faster than light. And what's interesting is just this week, there's actually been experimental proof from CERN where they've actually measured particles moving faster than the speed of light. So Einstein's theory of relativity is about to undergo another revision. And I believe where this revision will be found is in the zero-point field, in this literally infinite sea of light that surrounds us and penetrates everything. We can't see it because we're in it. And it's a very short wavelength, but it literally connects everything. Next slide, please. Oh, so my model for the microtubules is they're like a fishing net, and they're actually lying on the edge of the quantum. Now, I actually believe that there's sufficient quantum energy to cause them to move. So it actually takes the information, and once the quantum energy, the quantum sea buffets this net of scaffolding that's through us, the sea of light makes it move enough that then becomes chemical information that's transferred to our body. So I believe that the microtubule system is the membrane between what we call the physical and what we call the quantum. And that's how this information is stored and moved around. And I basically believe the purpose of being alive is that we inform this field. Every one of us creates a unique wave that is captured within the quantum field, within the zero-point field. And then whenever two waves meet, they become entangled. So both fields contain all the information of the other one, even if they separate. So if you consider that this field's been in existence since the moment of the Big Bang, and everything that's ever existed has informed it, and that all of these waves are crisscrossing and becoming a greater mag, a greater wave, for me, if I was looking for the mind of God, this is where it resides. And I think there's still levels of the infinite beyond that, but this is as close as we can get to understanding that mystical experience, because you really, really do experience the totality of knowledge that's been generated by the universe. And this is this idea of multiverses, that when this universe collapses, that information will actually be stored in the field to inform the next universe towards a more complicated. Because I believe basically consciousness is evolving towards recognition of itself. And that's what human beings are. And the other interesting thing about the microtubule system is it's right smack in the middle of the cosmic scale. So if you're going to have the very smallest things, the Planck length, and the very largest galactic clusters and things at full edge, we occupy the center. Now, if you're going to create a machine that could experience the wholeness of existence, where would it be? It would be right in the middle, because then it understands what's big and it understands what's small. So the fact that a human microtubule system actually really straddles the center of the galactic scale, to me, I find it funny that we spent hundreds of years trying to get away from this idea that we're at the center of the universe and we keep finding ourselves back. You know. Next, please. Where are we at? So yeah, the mystical entheogenic, or next, please. Oh, actually, no, sorry, go back. Lost something. Back one, please. Back two. Okay, yeah, this is a good one. This is from Maslow. The evidence that surfaces, surprising as it may be, indicates that our brain is not limited to the neural processes that go on within our cranium. It is a wideband receiver and high-powered processor of information. This information it receives originates not only in our body, but comes from all over the world. The brain's 10 billion neurons, with 10,000 connections each, constitute the most complex system of electronic organization in the known universe. This system, which operates at the edge of chaos, receives and transforms information from our own body, as well as the electromagnetic, acoustic, and other wave fields in our environment. It also receives and decodes information from more subtle fields, including the vacuum zero-point hollow field. Potentially, our brain connects us with the wide reaches of the cosmos. As mystics, prophets, and people of insight and sensitivity intuited throughout the ages, our brain is an integral part of the universe, and the mind is a potentially open window on it. It's up to us to throw open that window to the full extent of our remarkable but hitherto largely unexploited physical and mental capacities. Irving Laszlo. Now Laszlo is one of the great Renaissance men of the century, and I was very excited when I discovered his work on the zero-point field, and I quite quickly came to the conclusion that this was the origination of the entheogenic experience. So I was very surprised to find out that he also thought that, and that he's good friends with Stan Grof. And in his book he actually mentions it in a couple of places that he thinks this is where the psychedelic experience resides. Next slide, please. So, you know, with the mystical experience, with this Bose-Einstein condensate, the obvious thing you go through is the loss of ego. And after I finished Tryptamine Palace, I became very interested in the contemporary spiritual philosopher Eckhart Tolle's ideas, and I've spent most of the last decade trying to integrate his concepts from a psychedelic perspective. Now, his definition of ego has many different definitions. So his ego is that thing that creates labels and divisions, the voice within your head. And it was, to me, it was a very abstract concept before I smoked 5-MeO DMT. And then afterwards it became a very real thing because I had experienced consciousness without its effect or its filter. And I actually think, next slide please, I actually think the most interesting, and this is where the medicalization of psychedelics worries me a little bit. Well, it doesn't worry me, but I think calling entheogens a medicine puts them in a box. Calling them a psychedelic puts them in another box. We have all these little boxes we try and put them in, and none of them really fill the full potential of what psychedelics are. So while I respect the idea that psychedelics can be used to cure many of the social ills, because really this, in 10 years of asking people who are healers, you know, what has been healed, the majority of the times I get replies that they're basically socially related illnesses. Depression especially can be cured by psychedelics, well-known fact, but much of what people are depressed about is reality. And at my first trip in Palace, I say we're suffering from extinction denial. And that there's never been a time in history when it's been so obvious that we've got a major crunch coming. And most of us, the majority of humanity, has just got its head in the sand. And that was one of the really interesting things to me about my 5-MeO DMT experiences, was that afterwards I felt like I had to make a contribution towards at least trying to change that. And you come across an idea they call liberation theology that says the political and the spiritual are very much intertwined. And if you have a major spiritual experience, that can often lead to an increase in political energy. They call contemplative activists. And we had some famous contemplative activists, we had Dalai Lama, Martin Luther King, we had Mother Teresa, we have a number of great examples, Gandhi, we have a number of extraordinary examples, even in this last century, of the power that a spiritual epiphany can bring into the world. And I know that my own 4 or 5 years after my own epiphany, when I look back at how much I actually did, because we had the Hurricane Katrina, I wrote my book, I built a giant art car, I ran a giant camp. I mean, I don't even understand how I found energy to actually achieve all the things that I achieved in the probably 5-year period directly after the 5-year DMT. So any of you that go through that spiritual epiphany, make good use of that energy. And be aware of a tendency towards evangelizing. I think there's this tendency that you do these things 2 or 3 times and you want to give them to everybody else, which is perfectly normal. Robert Venosa, the great visionary artist, one of my favourite painters, once said to me, you've got to do something for 10 years before people take you seriously. And I think there's something to be said about it for that. And I also, coming back to the ego, Eckhart Tolle says the ego is constantly trying to convince you it's reformed itself. And so what I see a lot happens a lot of times with those psychedelic experiences, people have the experience and then they're convinced they're reformed, so now they become a healer or a shaman and they stop working on themselves. I do believe that the ego is like a muscle and the psychedelics shred it, but then afterwards it builds up stronger. And I think in the 60s we had a lot of examples of the psychedelic leadership blowing out because the egos got so big. They started at a really good place, but there's danger in doing psychedelics too often. You definitely need periods of integration in between the use. And there's a big danger in thinking that the psychedelics are the answer. They're just a tool. As in Zen they say, don't mistake the finger that points at the moon for the moon. So Martin and I were invited to the non-duality conference a few years ago with Rick Doblin and James Fadman and a few other characters. And they gave us, what was it, Martin, 15 minutes to talk or something? 20 minutes? And I was like, oh God, I talk for hours, why don't I talk about it for 15 minutes? So I had been thinking about this concept that ended up becoming what I call the Oroc law of infusions. It's a little tongue-in-cheek. And I said, okay, everything has a scale. Scales are arbitrary. Right? You just create scales. So I'm going to create a scale based on the ego. And I'm going to put compounds that most disrupt the ego on top. And I'm going to put the compounds that most reinforce the ego on the bottom. Right? So when you draw this up, at the scale, you've got 5-MeO-DMT on top, DMT, LSD, and you run down through the list. And it sort of goes to classic psychedelics, to the phenethylamines, and you get into the pathogens, this kind of grey area of weed and opiates. And then you get out into the really dirty shit, coke, meth, and alcohol. Cocaine's the ultimate ego drug. A whole bunch of people stand around going, me, with the backs in the hand. Alcohol, you think your ego is so important, you get in a fight over your own thing. Now what's interesting to me is when I looked at this list, there was a direct correlation to toxicity. So the highest ones on the list were actually endogenous. Our body produced them. LSD is the least toxic thing known to man. I've checked this fact, it sounds extraordinary. But you can take the same amount of plutonium or cyanide and it will pass through your body and you won't even notice it. the physical amount of LSD that it takes to have an effect, it makes it the least toxic thing we know. Then as we go down the list, they get more and more and more toxic. Cocaine, alcohol, and meth being the most physically toxic. So our bodies and our brains are very clear, I think, with the kind of compounds that they want us to take. Our society requires these other compounds to get people going to work.
Oh.
I don't know how many people have read Michael Pollan's book, which I thought was very well written, very well researched, and probably the most boring book I've ever read. But there's a really great bit in a paragraph where he describes exactly to me what happened, and he sort of does it offhandedly. He says, there was a point there when he gave us a bag of mushrooms, and him and his wife had a couple of experiences. And then the mushrooms, they got too busy. They were New Yorkers with careers. And he says, the idea of taking an afternoon off to do psychedelics seemed incomprehensible. And then he says the mushrooms were in the pantry. And then he says, and then a drug came along that was much easier to integrate into the fabric of Manhattan social life, cocaine. And the next time we cleaned out the pantry, we threw the mushrooms out. Now this is what happened to psychedelic culture. We ran into the 80s. Right? Now, we're going through a full circle. You know, the Trove 13 concept, we've been wandering in the wilderness for 40 years, and we're about to come back. This instinctively. I do think it ironic that we may look at the 90s as being one of the great psychonautical periods of history. Because what I see now, as psychedelics become more mainstream and more popular, is a fallback on the same kind of cultism that we saw in the 60s. And a lot of New Age concepts that I think keep pulling us back to there was a moment there in the early 2000s when psychedelic culture and Burning Man and many other things were kind of poised to go in a more William Gibson, neurohacker kind of a direction. And I feel as we've become more popular, we're falling back onto these old routines and old models. I don't know what other people think about that. The fact that 5-MeO-DMT and 5-methoxy, next slide, are endogenous is very interesting to me. And I actually think if there was one area of psychedelic study that deserves most human interest is this. Now the fact that they are endogenous is still not proven, and it's somewhat of debate. And we also seem to be, if it is endogenous, the big question is, would there ever be enough DMT to actually have an effect? But since you're talking about something that happens on working healthy minds, and you can't just cut up and see what's going on, it's a very open question. There's evidence on both sides of the field currently. DMT, the spirit molecule, did as much harm as it did good. Because Strassman makes his hypothesis with his facts a little too liberally. And if you read it carefully, you see what he's saying, but a lot of people didn't read it carefully enough. So now we have a whole lot of mythology going around with DMT that's completely inaccurate. The idea that you get flooded by DMT when you're born and you die, yeah, it's possible. There's lots of interesting ideas, but it's important to remember they are hypotheses. But what I find fascinating is maybe DMT and 5-MeO-DMT aren't endogenous. I had a great mentor in Nick Sand, who was the inventor of Orange Sunshine LSD. I first started putting out to smoke DMT, and I met him in the San Jose MAPS conference in 2010. He just got out of jail. I had read his arrest report online, because you can find anything online if you look. And Nick got busted with an amazing amount of stuff. He had enough acid, 2 hits for every Canadian or something. He had 4 kilos of DMT. 4 kilos of DMT. But he didn't have any 5-MeO-DMT. And they actually asked him, now that that's dead, we can give him a round of applause, but he was out to make 1,000 years worth of acid, or 10,000 years worth of acid. And I wouldn't be surprised if he did. This is where the lab that they busted in 1997 was one of the largest and most complicated ever found. And here's a funny side story. They sent the samples of LSD to the DEA, and they came back as 102% pure. And the DEA is like, well, hang on, we got this test, how can it be purer? And Sergeant Shulgin said he thought that the DEA samples had degraded over time, and that this was real pure. So anyway, when I first met Nick, I started, Mr. Sands, we're embarrassing, I just read your police report. I see you're not a big fan of 5-hydroxy-DMT. And his wife started laughing. It turned out she was a big fan. And that was the start of a great friendship for me and Nick. And he explained that he had a seizure on 6 milligrams of Synthetic. And I think this is an interesting question I'd like to pose to facilitators is, I find if you're at a very low threshold levels, there's more of a chance of a seizure and more of a chance of a physical reaction because there's not enough of the vitamin to actually have a local release. I don't know what other people think about that, but in my experience, that's why I think there's that sort of sweet spot that gets you to release without a lot of stress that comes with lower dosages. So the idea, there's definitely a sweet spot in between too much and too little. But the way that Mick described it to me, he said he'd given it a lot of thought. And he described DMT as the fullness and 5-hydroxy-DMT as the void. And in these lectures I compare them to the Kundalini, to the 6th and the 7th chakra. And I say DMT occupies the 6th chakra, which is the level that all gods and goddesses could be imagined and seen, anything that could be visualized, existed, all the beauty, all the mythology, all the wonder, exists at the 6th chakra, which is DMT. But when you go to the 7th chakra, at the 6th chakra there's still separation between you and God, between you and the beloved. When you go to the 7th chakra, the mystical experience occurs, and all these divisions collapse. And there is no division between you and God. Ramakrishna used to be able to describe the ascent of the Kundalini to his students, and when he reached the 7th, he would pass out because he couldn't describe the 7th; it was undescribable. So for me, this is very much the realm of 5-DMT. And I think it's fascinating that potentially these two compounds are being produced naturally within our body. One produces the mythological experience, one produces the mystical experience. All human spirituality is a tension between the mystical and the mythological. Practically every religion has started with a mystical experience that's basically unexpressible. So a localized mythology has been created around that ineffable experience. So you'd think that human, where we were today, we would be interested in the fact that these compounds exist in our body. They got a Nobel Prize for the discovery of natural opioids in our body, and the discovery of natural psychedelics, which is far more difficult, has practically been ignored. I look forward to a day when these things come back into broader study. Can we go down 3 slides, please? I'm going to finish off reading from the book here in a second. A few people have come up to me at this conference and said, why don't you like smoking topium? Or why don't you smoke topium? I'm not sure where they've got that from. I haven't seen it in the book. I like topium. I just find that it's a little more difficult to work with because I think you don't know how much vitamin DMT is present in the venom, and I think that synthetic is much more precise. And for me, I know there's a lot of discussion about the differences, but for me, phenomenologically, I have practically the identical experience on either, I do find Toad a little soft in the way it comes on. It's lovely. So as I get towards wrapping up this talk, I would feel that I have to mention a few of my concerns. There's a definite explosion of the use of toad venom globally, and there are a number of people who know more about it than me who seem to feel that there is a significant ecological impact on the toad population. It's also true that their environments are becoming endangered, so that's also causing a concern. I see this return to sort of a 60s New Age cultism and the cult of the personality, which is inevitable, but I would say to all practitioners, just recognise the fact that when a person goes through that experience, they're like a newborn, and the first thing they see when they open their eyes is like the mother-father image to them, and you are a very, you have a great responsibility by being the person that is there when they come out of that experience. I personally think the attempt to create the idea that there was that toad venom is somehow shamanistic or it was used by ancient cultures is a little disingenuous. I find it interesting that there's a lot of mixing going on. You see practitioners come and they're offering all these different things. I find that a little worrisome. There's this guy who just came through Utah. These are the kind of things that are popping up all over Facebook now. And there's this guy, Dr. Bufo, who was mail ordering toad venom to people that he cold contacts on Facebook. And things like that, when you have a resource that's worth a lot of money in a third world country, that creates a lot of negative energies. So, with all the things that we take, it's one of the reasons I think our community should be completely against cocaine, is the tremendous social cost that that compound generates in other communities. So I think, and we have something of an issue with MDMA these days as well, because the saffron trees in China and Borneo that they start to make the MDMA are causing massive deforestation, massive problems for our Western hunger for these drugs. So I think that it's ethically we should be very much considering what we take and how we take them. I think some of the pressure on the toad populations will be relieved once we have a plant extract, much the way the DMT is being extracted from Mimosa hostilis or acacia. I know there's some good minds working on that presently, and I wouldn't be surprised within the next couple of years if we see these recipes online, which will then result hopefully in a more readily supply of the compound. Because as we get to the patient shaman psychonaut question, to me the psychonaut is the more noble path. We're all interested in psychedelics. We've all come from somewhere. We all have a psychedelic history. We do much better if we form cells within our own communities and work together as cells, recognize the elders, recognize the people that have the experience, create a viable structure within each community rather than relying on people that come to town and come to town. And I think we need to integrate psychedelics throughout our culture. So maybe this is where it starts. I'm going to read from the end of the book. Sorry. Just a bit. So in this experience, I have a place in the Dominican Republic that's one of my favourite places to journey in. And I had a really good day kite surfing, and I got back to the house. With me, I don't schedule my psychedelic experiences. They tend to just be like, oh, today's the day. And this was one of those days. I got back and I was like, oh man, it's a great day, you know. And I was like, oh, I've still got some toad. Because even though it had been like a year and a half since I've been in Mexico, I still had a good stash in my freezer. So I pulled it out of the freezer, and I was very upset with finding it gone black and looked like I'd ruined it. I was like, oh, typical, you go through all this trouble to get the rarest drug known to man, and you let it go bad from not letting it sitting around. I spoke some. I had a nice little experience, pure and simple healing. So then I went into the bathroom and I came back and I picked up the glass bottle, looking at its contents in curiosity. The scientists in me noticed that the venom had blackened and re-solidified in a hard layer across the top of the bottle. The hog in me saw that there was still plenty left. I felt so grateful for the experience I just had that I wanted to share the venom with some people I loved. It seemed wrong to hold on to it all for myself. But I knew there was more in the freezer, and I rationalised that I had probably taken most of the 5-MeO DMT with the first hit, so the second hit should inevitably be milder. Now remember, this is token. Nevertheless, I was grinning when I raised the pipe back up to my lips, still high from the first pipe, and the little voice in my head said, "Greedy, greedy," as I sucked in with a strong and steady drawl. The effect was obvious immediately, even before I exhaled my breath in a short, stubborn gasp containing no smoke. It was just like the 5-MeO DMT trip report from Takao that I quoted in the introduction, which says the entire universe imploded through my consciousness. That is a good way of describing it as any. Even though I've tried to say in this book, and an incalculable amount of other things, all happened simultaneously in a cosmic flash of pure insight. I went through all the different levels that I have described as one, moving through a timeless reality in a manner impossible to describe. I saw the teeming multitudes. I heard dogs barking and children playing, and I expanded out behind the stars, all the while fearless and at peace, cocooned in a field of immeasurable love. Pure love. There is no other way to describe it. It was the same love I had found my first time, the same love that had come when I asked it to name itself. It was the love that had been missing during my last few experiences, replaced by that awesome power. Yet I knew the love and the power were the same. Their tangled grey represented the creation principle of the universe and beyond, from the infinite emanation of forms to the form without form that I can only call God. That mighty love drew me up and pulled me in. Lost in that moment outside of time, I knew that love was me and my life and my wife and my friends and my dog Coda who had died. Love was Mom's ball and Booney Man. Love was this life we are all blessed with, this planet, this galaxy. Love created all of it, since love is the creation principle. Love is all. It makes everything possible and ultimately guides the universe in some mysterious, unknown way. And if the light is the energy of God, then the love is God's plan. In the preface to Alex Gray's book Sacred Mirrors, Alison Gray relates a shared psychedelic experience between the two artists that would shape both their personal and artistic futures. On June 3rd, 1976, we simultaneously shared the same psychedelic vision, an experience of universal mind madness. Our shared consciousness, no longer identified with or limited by our physical bodies, was moving at tremendous speed through an inner universe of fantastic changes in imagery, infinitely multiplying in parallel mirrors. At a super-orgasmic pitch of speed and bliss, we became individual fountains and drains of light, interlocked with an infinite omnidirectional network of fountains and drains composed of and circulating a brilliant, iridescent love energy. We were the light, and the light was God. That light of love drew me up and made me understand what was happening, what I was really seeing, until the singular realization, as bright as any burning star, exploded in my mind, brighter than the dawn of day. I exist with God. This is real. This is reality. God exists. And for a single internal moment outside of time, God and I were one. The light of lights, the most bright, sublime cosmic love and intelligence. Consciousness recognizes the beginning and the end of everything. Two things made this toe-venom experience unique. The softness of the experience, without an almost total lack of the fear, and the fact that the entire time I was partially aware that I was still sitting in my armchair. My separate consciousness was somehow able to resonate with what I consider an ultimate 5-year DMT experience, the union of God. And yet, bizarrely, at the same time, still cognizant of my physical existence. At the point when my mind actually fully opened up to union with God, I think I did lose contact with this physical reality, and more time passed than I realized, probably 10 minutes. I was still dislocated in time and wondering what was going on. Then I realized exactly what had happened as I tried to hold on to the last fleeting moments of the light and love. 3 years after my initiation, this was undoubtedly the most beautiful 5-year DMT experience I ever had. Laughing with the sheer exhilarated joy of it, I collapsed out of the chair and lay spread eagle on the floor. At the moment, nothing I have written in this book seemed relevant. Not a single word came close to describing how I felt, and I laughed at the absurdity of trying to describe it. Confounded by the sheer zen nature of the 5-year, I realized that I could have summed this whole book up in a couple of words. No God. Or more simply in one word, God. And still, no one without that experience would be able to understand it. The revelation confirmed that I was God. God was in me and that God was in all of us. Like the Gnostics believe, our purpose in life is to bring ourselves closer to God, to improve ourselves in order to be more than we are, to fill ourselves up with that light. What possible use was my silly book compared to that? Then the voice came to me like it does, loud and clear, inside my head. Don't you stop, just keep going. And so I have, giggling like an excited child, high on love, thinking all the while, that came out of a toe?